18, everybody. And we were talking about a moment ago what the Real Estate Commission can do should you violate any license law. And we said censor, reprimand, suspend, or revoke. Azure has a cute little acronym for that, and she says cursor, CRSR. So any way you can remember, but remind yourself the commission won't monetarily fine us. They don't get involved in any kind of a commission dispute. If you have a buyer who bought from somebody else, another agent, the Real Estate Commission will not hear that complaint. If you send it to the commission and say, somebody else stole my buyer and I should be having that commission, they will just send it back to you. They don't get involved in any kind of arbitration. They just don't do that. If you have a dispute like that, you would go to your broker in charge first. If you are a realtor, member of the Board of Realtors, they have arbitration committee, they have mediation, they can help you work things out. And then there are people that do mediation for a living, so you can hire somebody to help you through these things. In this section of Appendix A, it also talks about that commercial license and that a commercial broker has a right to seek a lien if they think that they're not going to be paid their commission. We talked about that early on. And if that broker doesn't think they're going to be paid a commission, after they've done the job and they get this feeling, we're not going to get our money, they can go seek a lien before closing, but after they've completed the job. Residential brokers don't have that right, do they? So if you have somebody who doesn't pay the commission that they're supposed to pay you, your broker in charge would have to seek small claims assistance if they want to pursue it. Why do you think I say if? May not be worth it? Why, Kristen?
Commission may not be enough matter.
Commission might not be enough to matter.
Or court costs.
Yeah.
Court costs? Well, it's branding, isn't it? Think about your name. In the public might not think the highest of, real estate agents or any salesperson for that matter, but the perception out there is this is an easy job. We make all the commission. We drive around in fancy cars. All we do is show and drive around, and it's easy. It's fun to show houses, and there's a whole lot goes on other than that. If someone doesn't want to pay your commission, your company might say PR is major, goodwill is major, and we don't want to pursue this maybe, or they may not. They may say, hey, you worked, you deserve it. We deserve it. We get paid when we do our work. But if they don't pursue it, it's because probably it's not worth it. Like Kristen said, it's not worth the risk of your of PR and goodwill. And even now, don't we have to worry about the reviews that go on Google and all of that? So I don't want you to think you shy away from it, because if you earn your commission, you work hard for it. I told y'all about that client I had, didn't I? That refused to pay my commission, and he was a special doctor, a specialist. He was I can't tell you because you might know who he is. Anyway, but I listed a property for him and sold it, and he said he wasn't going to pay me because he felt like he found the buyer. Well, guys, remember on the exclusive right to sell, it doesn't matter. We get paid, don't we?
He's going to say this on YouTube.
I'm not mentioning his name. Oh my God. Edit that out. Moving on along. Go with me to page 6. Just keep me straight. I've never been on TV. Go to page 618, everybody. Student asked me today about getting confused about the material fact questions about willful omission, negligent omission, and misrepresentation. She said that she was struggling with the difference between misrepresentation and omission. Now, I want to understand why that's confusing, misrepresentation or omission. If you get a scenario fact question, and you will, and it'll be wordy, the agent did something wrong, he either said something wrong or he left out a material fact, and you've got to decide, was it omission or misrepresentation, and which one of those, was it negligent or willful? And she's not the only student has expressed that concern. I have a hard time between misrepresentation and omission. Misrepresentation, you are saying something. You're expressing in words, even maybe emailing, but you're saying it and it's incorrect. It's a lie or it's incorrect, one way or the other. Omission, you just left it out. You did not tell, maybe because you didn't know. You did not tell because you didn't want to tell. But omission is just leaving out a fact. Misrepresentation is answering the question and it's a lie.
Omission you didn't mention.
Huh?
Omission that you didn't mention.
Omission you didn't mention. That's right. But students tell me they struggle with that. Can you tell me why that's confusing maybe? Does anybody, Debbie?
But yeah, what about if I know a material fact, but I just forget, they ask me the question, and I just forget to tell them like, does the roof leak? And I forget, oh yeah, I gotta tell them the roof.
It would be negligent, whatever. If you didn't say anything, it would be negligent omission. If you said it incorrectly because you forgot, it will be negligent misrepresentation. Generally, negligence is you made a mistake. Generally, negligence is you forgot, or you typed, it was a typo, like square footage, 3,200 and you put, or 2,300 and you put 32. That's negligence. It's not with intent to deceive or mislead. But sometimes that intentional or willful is a little hard to understand too. The commission says if it's something that you should have known and you didn't check, like some of the examples, and that's what I would recommend that you all do is look at some of these examples in your appendix. Some of the examples are really close, and you have to really read it to see if you see the distinction.
So with omission, you're saying that if I just don't say anything about it at all, so then how do you discern if it's negligent or
Willful? Willful is, a road's coming through, but you didn't say anything about it. You know that when this road comes through, the value of the property is going to increase, but you didn't tell the seller. Remember, guys, material facts have to be told to both parties, right? That would be willful omission. A road's coming through and you didn't know, but it's been in the papers and guys, roads just don't come through. Aren't they on the plan? They're on the books forever. Commission says that's something you ought to know if you're in the real estate business. And you don't know it, that still could be willful because you're supposed to know it. Negligence is more of a mistake. Negligence is more of misquoting a seller, or the seller tells you something that's incorrect and you quoted it. That may be more negligence. Like a seller telling you that they redid the kitchen and the countertops are granite. Guys, I've been looking at stuff like that. I wouldn't be able to tell granite from fake granite, to be honest with you. And so if the seller said this is granite, I'm not an expert. I might say this is granite. And the commission might say that's negligence if you repeat it and it's wrong. Maybe you shouldn't repeat it. If I were showing a property and the buyer asked me, are the countertops granite? And if the seller told me they are, I'm going to answer the question like this. The seller told me they're granite. I personally have not verified it. If it is an important feature to you, let's get somebody, a builder or somebody who's knowledgeable to tell us for sure. I have a friend in the real estate business, and the listing agent put on the sheet granite countertops. The friend of mine was a buyer's agent, and he took the information that was in the MLS, granite countertops, told the buyer, well, it says granite countertops. Buyer got mad about something else, and that's usually how it goes. They get mad about something, and then they want to complain about, they'll complain about you. if they complain to the commission checks to see, is this a legitimate complaint and do we need to investigate it? Well, they investigated because they felt like there was some negligence there or something. When the commission investigates everybody, it's kind of like being sued in a way. There's no hurry up about it. You have to wait and see, what they will say. And so it took 3 months. And imagine if you're a licensee waiting to know, am I going to get reprimanded or suspended? What's going to happen to my license? They reprimanded him, and they said that it was negligent, and to be more careful, that he quoted that those were granite countertops. It upset my friend because the listing agent didn't get in trouble. The listing agent, if you read Appendix A, is held to a higher standard. But the buyer complained about his buyer agent, and that's what the commission looked at and said that was negligent for not really knowing and maybe even taking somebody's word. And even in your reading it says once you're a buyer's agent instead of a seller sub, you're held to a high standard too, aren't you? Because you're an agency to the buyer. So it is closed, Debbie and everybody, this negligence versus willful. But go with me, if you will, to page 618 and 619. Actually, as a reminder, remind yourself when they bring up material facts that it's the real estate broker who is accountable for that, not the seller. The seller is not the one that is supposed to disclose material facts. Why is that?
They have their paper, the residential.
Property disclosure?
Disclosure, and that's all they have to disclose is.
Do they have to disclose on that disclosure form?
Then they can say,
They can say no representation, can't they? So what I'm getting to as a question, why does the seller not have to disclose? And it's because we're in a buyer beware state. Remember caveat emptor? I can think of one thing that the seller would have to disclose, and that's if they know there's lead in the paint. And if they know there's lead in the paint, how do you know there's lead in the paint? And show us the reports or however you got the information. The agents are the ones who are supposed to disclose this. But they're reminding you that death of somebody dying in the property is not a material fact. Somebody being real sick in the property is not a material fact. Sex offender, not a material fact. The crime rate, maybe not material fact. But what do y'all think about that? What's not a material fact?
You said there's a sex offender next door.
Yes,
It's not a material fact.
I was confused reading this because it said if they ask if there's sex offenders, you can link them to the website, but it also said, don't, if you know, you don't have to tell them, but you can tell them. Like, I was confused about that.
Okay, here's what she's saying. Ashley's asking, Ashley said it's a little confusing the way they say it's not a material fact, but if it's not a material fact, you can't lie about it. So if you know there's a sex offender next door or in the neighborhood and the seller's selling the property because of that reason, it's not a material fact, which means you don't have to tell. If someone comes to you and asks you specifically, are there sex offenders in this neighborhood, you can refuse to answer the question, or you can say you need to check that out on your own, but you cannot lie about it. So you can't, if you lie about it, it's misrepresentation, even though it's not a material fact per se, right? So you can refuse to answer it, which is odd. Somebody asking you say, I don't want to answer that question. It's almost like saying, yeah, there are. But I think as an agent, whether it's the listing agent or the selling agent, you ought to have a list of every website that you can think would help most people, so that you're not just saying to this person, I think you ought to check the sex offender site, because that's almost like telling them, isn't it? And guys, here's the thing. You might think, well, why not tell them? Well, if you're representing the seller, that could harm the sale, couldn't it? You could hurt your seller by disclosing that. It's not that we're concealing it, it's just not a requirement to disclose it.
You answered my question.
Oh,
You
I-
just answered my question.
What was your question?
I had a kind of a weird thing about this quote in here. An agent need only answer truthfully to the best of his or her knowledge. Being that there's a lot of things that I can't say in my work now, it's a little bit confusing because if someone asks me now, I can't say anything.
Well, you can't answer questions that would have you violate another law, like how many Baptist people live in this neighborhood? You can't answer that question even if you know, right?
Right.
And you would have to say, I'm not allowed to answer that question. It's a violation of federal and North Carolina fair housing. So the commission says, if you do something that breaks another, you shouldn't be required to do something that would break another law.
Okay.
And so that's that. All right, so let's look at some of the examples. Willful misrepresentation. Now look in your right-hand column, page 619. The first three examples say an agent knows. So there's a clue. If you get a question and the agent knows that there's water intrusion and they lie about it. Agent knows the heat pump doesn't work and they lie about it. So the clue to me, one clue is that's willful because you know it and you're telling a lie anyway. Look at your fourth example though. An agent is completely unfamiliar with the features of the property. It's not your listing maybe, and you're unfamiliar. And the agent informs the buyer that the plumbing is in good working order without checking with the owner. The commission says, without regard to the truth, you answered a question that you don't know. Are you with me? That's willful. You willfully decided to answer a question that you don't know. And that would be willful misrepresentation. And they've got another one, without checking with an owner. An agent tells a buyer that the heating and cooling costs are very reasonable. Without checking with the owner or checking with Duke Power, you can call them and say, tell me what the average is. You really shouldn't answer questions if you don't know them. Now, I understand that can be embarrassing because we are supposed to know things, aren't we, about houses and real estate? But it'd be way better for you to say, let me write that down and I'll check it out. And even if they keep asking you, let me write that on my list too, I'll check it out. Ooh, gee, there's a lot I'm going to be checking out, but I'll get right back with you just as soon as I can. Way better than answering the question incorrectly. It's too risky. Because if they rely on that and then buy the house and then that's not true, not only would you be guilty of violating license law, but you could be sued from that person. And you don't want that to happen. Now let's look at negligent. Negligent misrepresentation is frequently in real estate. It's common where we're negligent, where we just say things maybe that we're not so sure of, or we make mistakes. Go with me to the next page, page 620. The first part of your column tells you about the listing agent, top of the left of 620, being held to a higher standard. Does that make sense to you that the listing agent would be held to a higher standard? Because they're first there and they're ascertaining everything about the property. They really need to discover and disclose and even advise the seller, here are some things that you probably need to do before we put this property on the market. Now look with me at example 1. This agent sold some property and the soil did perk, or the soil was suitable for drainage for a septic tank. And selling another lot in the neighborhood, this agent presumed that the soil would be suitable. And the commission says that's negligent without verifying it. Example 2, the owner tells the agent that it's 1850 square feet. Guys, right there, that's a problem. you need to measure before you quote square footage, don't you? Did you read over your appendix C, the square footage appendix? It says, and I don't know if you read this or I want to know what you think about it. Square footage is not considered a material fact by the Real Estate Commission. They don't make us measure houses and advertise them. I have to tell you, because I've been in the business a long time, we created that little monster ourselves, for ourselves. Real estate agents have always measured property and put the square footage in the paper or on MLS, and then what happens, buyers count on the square footage being accurate. And then when it's not, we're in trouble. Square footage is a requirement for your MLS data sheet, you know, that you measure and put it in there, but it's not a material fact issue that the commission says you must do. However, since we do the measurement for MLS purposes, the commission says you need to be accurate. You need to know how to measure a property, and your Appendix C would be worthwhile for you all to look at. You might have a test question on how do you measure stairs? You know, what is considered heated living area? Remember the finished and the permanent heat and directly accessible from one room, from one door to another room.
And we should be like we're not too familiar with how to measure it accurately. They on our whoever we affiliate ourselves with, they should be trained on those type of things.
You should, your broker in charge should help you with that. The commission says, or you find somebody at the company who knows how, or you can even hire an appraiser to do it for you. Now, when you're first starting out, you don't want to be just spending money. I mean, you're going to get out there, get mentor with somebody or shadow somebody and say, let me see how you measure. And the way that we measure is exterior, and then we go in to see if there are any insets or any jut outs, you know, to see about measuring. But Justin, you should affiliate with a broker in charge that takes you under their wing and helps you, because aren't they responsible for you? And if you go misquote, they're going to be responsible while you're on PB status.
Is there any way to kind of get more justification between willing and negligent? Because-
Reading these examples is the
Well,
best.
The first example on the negligent, the 35-acre lot.
Yeah.
With what this lot perks. If you're saying that you know this lot perks and you have no clue of the lot down there, you know that there's a possibility that lot is not going to perk.
Well, this person's assuming that it will, because maybe some lots in that area perked, and they're just assuming that right here in this area, that next one will perk.
Right, but I mean, realistically, I would think that they would be intelligent enough to have a thought in their mind that could be wrong, that there's a possibility that it's not. 'Cause I
Well,
know for a fact that I have no clue if it's purple or not.
So,
Like I willingly know.
in the.
well, but it's not that cut and dry. The commission, I guess, has sort of given you the benefit of the doubt. You know, most of the lots perk in this area, or this one right next door. You know, that is risky, because even on your lot, one area could perk on your lot and this other side of your lot won't. We should know that. You would get in trouble, but the commission says it's more negligent by making an assumption like that. And it is close.
Say assumptions can be leaned
Bad.
further than
Yeah.
negligence.
Yeah, I would think. Just quoting, it is close to, yes, the furnace works. That's close to what we're talking about
Well, they
here,
don't really know
but
if it
you
does
just
or not.
don't know, and you're quoting it. I see what
But
you're,
if you don't know that lot 3
I
miles
know.
down will perk and you say it will because this one will,
I
you
know.
know that's still questionable.
But it's a little bit, not as much willful, because the lot next door did perk. So you're using some information, you're relying on it, and it could be wrong, but not to the standard of willful. I get what you're saying, and that's what students tell me. These are so close, it's hard to tell. That's why I wanted you to read these examples and see if we can see just a little sliver of something that will set one apart from the other. And frankly, if the commission had that complaint, they could have said willful. You know, because in the reading it says it may be negligent, it may be willful. And so we're going to look at our example. Our example for your final is going to be way more straightforward. And you should be able to, based on what I've said tonight already, you should be able to figure out what it is.
In the financial industry, we have like the same terminology, and essentially if there's a past situation which you can tap into for that information that's negligent, I always remember willful, I will lie. I know that it's not a fact, but I willfully or will tell the opposite of it.
I know it's not a fact. This person doesn't know it's not a
But they're
fact.
assuming based off of past history,
Yeah.
that it's negligent.
Yeah. But I hear Kevin, and I know most of you are thinking that it is awfully close. That's why I wanted to take a chance to show you some of these examples so that you can kind of see a little bit of the difference. Let's look at a couple of more here, everybody, so we can move on. Go with me to your right column on 620 and look at your willful omission. And your first example says an agent knows. Willful is more that you know or should have known, and you don't know for sure that lot didn't perk, and you know one did right beside it. It's negligent to make that jump. But this one, they know there's a zoning change coming, and it could affect the value, and they don't tell. They intentionally left that out. That's willful omission. Look at your second example. They know the city just decided to extend water lines to a particular subdivision, and it's going to increase the value of the home. I think this example, this agent is a buyer's agent. Remember, you're supposed to tell all material facts to all parties. The seller has the right to know that, don't they? It can increase the value of their home.
And when the value increase, the taxes increase, right?
When the taxes increase when the municipality does the reassessment.
Okay.
Remember, that's done every 4 years around here. Must be done within 8 years.
Okay, I understand how, different ways that can negatively, impact it.
Look at your right-hand column on 621. These are some examples of negligent omission. Negligent omission, listing agent lists a house for sale next to a street that's going to be widened. The project has been highly publicized, but I believe this agent just wasn't aware of it. The commission says you should be aware of that. So that's going to be negligence. The next example, the commercial property cannot be expanded according to zoning laws any more than 30,000 square feet, and this particular person needs 50,000 square feet, and it was left out. The agent didn't tell them. And maybe they didn't know, and that's going to be a little negligent. The commission says there's some things that you should know. So try to look at this and not to overthink it too much, even though I know it's real close and it's a little bit gray. Try to find a difference, a word maybe that would help you. Now,
The word no, can we repeat?
Huh?
For the test purposes, can we look at it for, are you gonna use the word, is the word no, the key word no versus should know? Is that the way to break this down?
Well, should know could be under willful also. You are aware of it, or you should have known could be under willful.
So willful is intentional and negligent is unintentional.
Yeah, yeah, unintentional.
Unintentional, but should have known.
But willful could be should have known too. Like, you shouldn't quote that the utility bills are low, because you could have verified it, right? And so you didn't know for sure, but before you quoted it, you should have known, because it's verifiable.
What it's really telling you to do is don't just say things because you want to look like an expert. If you're not a septic tank inspector and you have not perked that yard, don't say this yard perk. Say, you know what, I'll get that checked on for you when the septic inspector comes by, or that's something you'll want to include in your survey, or whatever you say. You don't act like an expert. You are in real estate. So they're gonna ask questions like you're a contractor, or like you're a builder, or like you're an appraiser, but you're not. And so the way that I did it is omission means you didn't say nothing. You didn't talk, period. And I got it down here, omission, sorry. And then misrepresentation means that you said it. I spoke and I said it. And if you're not sure of what you're saying, what she's saying is the commission will look at it as willful or negligent. If you are not sure, if you're absolutely sure and you have something to back it up, say what you want to say. But make sure you have something to back it up.
I got a call from a licensed broker today, and it's along these lines. It is highly recommended by the Real Estate Commission, if you list a property in the county, you need to pull this septic tank permit, because how many bedrooms are you going to advertise? And the owner could be using the property for 4 bedrooms after the house was built and after the inspection. But you need to know exactly what the soil suitability test or the percolation test said, because when you advertise it and you advertise wrong, that's going to be misrepresentation, isn't it? And that might be more willful than negligence. And so you just really need to be careful. And this agent was telling me that she researched and couldn't find out, and has the documentation about it. So the commission expects you to do what you can to find out, right? And do your best. You're not a title searcher. You're not a health department employee that you can go do the percolation test or that, but the commission says use your best efforts, that what a reasonable person would do. And so you might have to search a little bit to find some answers to things. Okay, real quick.
And I also wonder, like, what does the septic tank have to do with actually the number of rooms?
It's about drainage for,
Oh, okay.
couldn't get it out.
Okay.
It's
I
about,
got a better video, okay.
yeah, it's about, you would think that the septic tank approval, you would think that it would tell you how many bathrooms you have to have. But it's really about how many people are going to be living there and using the facility, and how well the soil drains. And so it would be in the county though, Justin, it wouldn't be in the city. And so remember what we said last night, that the occupancy rule is 2 heartbeats per bedroom. So that's why they're counting on bedrooms. This is suitable for a 3-bedroom, maybe 6 people. The people part doesn't come into play, I'm just adding that on. But it gets approved or for the number of bedrooms. And when you misquote that, the commission is going to look seriously at that. Your broker in charge, when you go to work now, because this has been a problem over the last few years, if you list a property that's in the county, in your file they're going to say, pull the septic tank permit. From whenever it was, go online, research it, and find it to put it in the file before you start advertising how many bedrooms. And by the way, MLS is a form of advertising. You know, if you put in the data sheet 4 bedrooms and it's only 3, that's misrepresentation. All right, and it's kind of one of those things that's happening right now where real estate agents are, where we have to be real careful. Go with me over to page 622. I mentioned to you about the false promise. If you buy this from me, I'll buy your refrigerator or whatever. That's a false promise if you don't do what you said. Conflict of interest. Interesting here that they bring up undisclosed dual agency for a conflict of interest. In Unit 7, Wayne taught you all this, the agency lecture. In Unit 7, he talked to you about that Adena lawsuit, didn't he? Where the real estate company, the largest real estate company in the United States at the time, and one of their agents messed up. Now, it wasn't really, here's where I think the agent messed up. Let me remind you the story. The agent was showing a buyer. Now, this was in the 90s, everybody, before we had buyer agency across the board. And so if we didn't have buyer agency, we wouldn't have had undisclosed dual agency, really and truly. So this agent was representing the seller because she worked for the firm that had the listing. So remind yourself, when you work for a company and a seller hired the company, we all are seller subs, aren't we? A buyer called to look at that property, and the agent showed the property. I can tell you that before buyer agency came along, and this is what happened here, we act like maybe we represent the buyer when we don't. Or the buyer perceives that we're their agent just because of our behavior, maybe being real nice or being real friendly or, having some commonality. And, but really, we're representing the seller, but back then, we didn't even have to tell. It wasn't a disclosure before the early 90s, early to mid 90s. Well, this buyer felt like this agent was her agent, and this buyer asked a material fact question. This was what got it started. The buyer asked this agent, "Is there an underground sprinkler system?" The agent responded, "Yes, there is." That's willful without checking it, because there was not. Why in the world would you answer a question like that when there is not, you don't even know, without regard to the truth? That's what started this class action suit, but the class action suit was about undisclosed dual agency. This buyer thought that this agent should have been looking out for her. And by saying that there was this and it wasn't, the buyer went to a lawyer. And the lawyer said, I'm surprised what the lawyer said a few times. The lawyer said it will cost you more to pursue it than to buy your own underground system. This buyer wouldn't let that go. The buyer just felt like that she was misrepresented, you could argue. So this buyer, the buyer and the lawyer finally, the lawyer finally agreed that there was more to this, and that at the very least, this buyer should have been told, "I don't represent you. Even though I'm acting like it, I'm being nice to you, but anything you say, I gotta tell the seller," right? That lawsuit ended up, it even ended up in the, what do they call those racketeering laws? RICO? There were 3 major lawsuits as a result of that. The lawsuit was for $250 million, and it was class action. So it wasn't just this one person. Lots of people said, they didn't disclose that to us either. They didn't tell us that we weren't their client. And so that started all of America and all of the real estate commissions around this country and all real estate licensees. Whoa, we better be looking at this and thinking about how we're doing our business. It ended up, the settlement was $19 million, but guys, I think they said like it said that this company did 6,000 transactions a year, and basically what they were given back was the commissions they earned over a certain amount of time. It was major. The ripple effects really scared real estate agents. So that's when the commission and the looking into, we need to talk about buyer agency. Sellers have always had a representative. Why can't the buyer have a representative? So that came about in North Carolina in the early 90s, like 93. And I'm telling you, the learning curve was major. If you're used to representing a seller and then all of a sudden you got to start representing a buyer or making it available, it was it doesn't sound scary to y'all, I'm sure, but back then it was a big leap for those of us who are in the business. And then we began to talk about dual agency. Undisclosed dual agency is a license law violation, and you must talk about your agency. So that reminds me about your Working with Agents brochure, everybody. The thing about this brochure is, number 1, the commission wrote it. Number 2, you cannot change any of the words in it. And number 3, you must review this no later than first substantial contact. Review it, not just say, here, read this at your convenience. You're supposed to review it. The other part of this brochure is you're reviewing it to give disclosure to the consumer about their rights. And then the next thing is you've got to establish agency. Didn't I give you all the example? It might have been my day class. Did I give you the example? It's kind of like going to a restaurant. If you go to a restaurant and a waiter comes over to you, they're giving you a menu, aren't they? And they're going to tell you the specials of the day and this and that, and they'll say, "I'll be right back." when the waiter or the waitress comes back, don't they want you to order something? Pick something, order something, right? That's sort of what we're doing as real estate agents. What do you choose, buyer? Do you want us to represent you or not? Now, I don't mean this in a silly way. I'm just trying to make a visual or an analogy. Pick something. It doesn't really matter what you choose, because I have to know which hat I'm wearing. I have to know if I'm going to represent the seller. I have to know if I'm going to represent you, or if we're going into dual agency. So this is a conversation that establishes what kind of agency you're going to be in. Vicki?
So, when you first meet them, that's substantial. Huh?
No, not when you first meet them.
Initial?
No. What you're asking, Nikki, can be tricky. First substantial contact is when the conversation shifts from facts about the property to something a little more personal, confidential, motivational. Let me give you an example. This is my opinion of first substantial in this illustration.
I was thinking you're probably off camera. Sorry.
I'm at an open house, and a buyer comes to a prospect comes to the open house. Just because they come to an open house, does that make it first substantial? Yes or no? No. Don't you think a lot of people come to the open house and they just want to look around, get ideas? Oftentimes it's neighbors wanting to see the property. It would be silly that I would have to say, stop, take a number. I got to explain this to you before you come through the house. That's a little silly, isn't it? However, if somebody comes to me, they're not a buyer yet, someone who came to the open house comes to me and says, it says on this MLS data sheet that living room is 10 by 12. Would you measure that for me, or can you verify that living room is 10 by 12? I want to know if my grandma's baby grand piano will fit there. My opinion is that's shifted. Does it make sense to you? It's shifted because they're trying to figure out if their stuff will fit there. They didn't tell me anything confidential about money anyway, but that's a little bit getting close that they're seeing themselves in this house, and I need to tell them what their rights are. So I would say something, I'll be happy to measure that room for you to verify it, but before we do, let me talk to you about the Working with Agents brochure, is what I would do. First substantial is between you and the prospect. What Nikki is bringing up though, everybody, there is a term called initial contact. And it is in your reading, and I'll show you where it is. It's called initial contact. And then we talked about the first substantial. So here's the way I would remember this for taking an exam. First substantial contact is between a real estate agent and a prospect. You're on the lookout for when did first substantial happen, if it did. Initial contact is between the real estate agent and the real estate company. More importantly is probably another company. So I'm going to say agent and a real estate company. Here's what that means. If I meet someone who wants to look at a house that another company has listed, I'm going to call that company. This is Jan Secor. I would like to make an appointment to show your house this afternoon at 3 o'clock on 123 North Elm Street. I am a buyer's agent. That's initial contact. Because I'm putting that company and their seller on notice that I represent the buyer. Y'all follow me? So that would be initial. Let me show you where that is in your textbook, because I want you to be able to read it. If you go with me to page 626, is that it?
Yes.
Page 626, disclosure, second paragraph down, disclosure of agency status. by buyer's agent to seller or seller's agent. Initial. Now, let's think that through for a minute. If I called another company to make an appointment and I said I'm a buyer's agent, that company's gonna pick up the phone and call the seller to make an appointment, aren't they? Seller, is it all right if somebody comes to see your house today? Will you be home, or should they use the lockbox or their super key? If the owner says, we'll be at home, don't you think they need to know that a buyer agent is coming, and they don't need to get into any conversation with that buyer agent? The buyer agent is representing somebody that has different interests than you do as an owner of the property. I would say, if I were their agent or sub-agent, if you can leave while the house is being shown, it would be a good idea. Guys, let me give you a little example of that. What if a buyer's agent showing the property to a young couple, and the agent has this young couple looking at the house, and the agent asks the seller, are there children in the neighborhood? Now, that's a legitimate question. That's not discriminating, I don't think. Are there children in the neighborhood? The seller owner sees this young couple and is assuming that they're young and they're going to have children. And the seller says, oh yes, there are lots of children in the area. They play in our yard and we just think it's so sweet and cute. And the seller looks at their buyer's agent, and the buyer agent looks at them, and this is not the house for them because of that one statement that seemed pretty innocent, but they shouldn't be talking to the buyer's agent. Are you with me on that? In fact, I would tell my owner, my seller, if a buyer's agent asks you something, you always need to say, call my agent. Because whatever you say, you could say it wrong. We're not saying to hide anything, but you're not an expert, right? And so, but the initial contact, what I was getting to is, when you call to make an appointment to show a property, you are to initially disclose your status with the buyer. Did I tell you about calling that company wanting to make an appointment to show a condominium? Did I?
That woman.
And she told me everything, and my mouth's open. I'm ready to say I'm a buyer's agent, but I can't get a word in edgewise. And she's telling me everything. Oh, I'm so glad you're going to show it, Jan. They're getting married in a week, and they'll leave the washer and the dryer, and they might even come down anymore. They just reduced the price, and I'm just listening. I didn't even have a chance to say, I'm a buyer's agent. She shouldn't have told me that, because I picked up the phone and called my buyer, and I said, I found you a good deal. I think I found you a good deal. You got a good deal. So you really need to be careful about that. So there is a difference. Nikki was asking about first substantial and initial. Now, I'm not trying to confuse you, but if a prospect calls you on the phone and they do start talking sometimes, we're looking for a house, we need to move here, we got to be here in a week, my mother-in-law's moving in with us and she's going to help us buy it. Guys, first substantial happened initially in that case. So it's when it crosses the line on just talking about the facts about the property versus talking about the person and their needs and their wants and that sort of thing. All righty. Back to, where were we, the undisclosed dual agency? So let me just ask you, do you have any questions about dual agency? Now, Wayne taught that, and I know Wayne does a good job, but it's really important that you understand it. For example, don't we know that listing agreements must be in writing at the beginning of the relationship? Don't we know that buyer agency agreements must be in writing at the beginning if you want to tie them down for a certain amount of time? Then you would have to have it in writing. Otherwise, the buyer's agency can be verbal at the beginning, right? In your reading here, it tells you in several places in Appendix A that when the commission agreed to buyer agency can be verbal at the beginning, it must be put in writing before you write an offer. The notion was this is temporary. It's not that we as real estate agents should work with a buyer under verbal agency indefinitely. It was meant to be temporary until that buyer feels comfortable with you. All right, let me give you a scenario. There's a listing, you got a listing from your seller. And when you went out to get the listing, you're talking about dual agency and dual designated because it's on the listing agreement. And the seller says, I don't want to give permission for dual agency, so we know you can't do dual designated either then. So you really tried to figure out why, and you tried to explain, and they said no dual agency. So you've got a listing agreement which nobody in your company can show to buy your clients. Is everybody with me on that? They can show to buy your customers, but not buy your clients. Are y'all good on that? All right, let me ask another way. Do buyers have to be clients? No. So buyers could come and they could say, I'm okay being a customer. So seller, you're telling us we can show them, but you're telling us we can't show our clients. So seller, you might be missing an opportunity for marketing. But the seller says, I don't want dual. Then, let's say that's my listing and Barry works in the same company with me, and Barry has a buyer client. And Barry calls me up and he says, Jan, I know that I see on the information that your seller did not give approval for dual agency, so I know I can't show the property without their approval. Barry says, but I've got a buyer that I think this will be a perfect match. Barry says, Jan, will you call the seller and see if they'll let us show it for this one exception? I owe it to my seller, don't you think, to see if they'll give us the exception. So before I call the seller though, guys, this is on your exam. I'm not just rambling. This is test question stuff. Before I call the seller, I'm gonna ask Barry this question. Barry, is your buyer agency agreement verbal or is your buyer agency agreement in writing? If Barry says his buyer agency agreement is verbal, I know that I can call the seller and ask the seller, will you give us permission for dual agency? We've got somebody, we don't want to miss the opportunity. Because his agency is verbal, I can get verbal permission from the seller to show the property. Is everybody with me? I'll show you where this is in the book. All right, let's rewind that. Seller didn't get permission for dual. Barry is an agent in the office, and Barry calls me up and says, Jan, I know I can't show it without their permission, but will you see if I can show the property? I've got a buyer I think will be perfect. Barry, is your buyer agency verbal or in writing? And Barry says it's in writing. That tells me something. I'm going to call the seller and ask them permission for Barry to show the property as a dual agent. And because his agency is in writing, I must get the approval for dual agency in writing before he even shows it. Is everybody? In other words, it has to be an even playing field. Let me show you where this is in your book so you can go back and read this, and I would. I highly recommend it. It's in Unit 7, and there are 3 examples. How about page 163? Page 163. You've got an example of situation 1. You've got a situation 2. And on the next page, you have a situation 3. That will give you some scenarios like I just mentioned, and I would read over it to make sure you understand it. Guys, this is level 3 agency, isn't it? You have to understand this and really inside out. This is real life real estate too, isn't it? And that would be what I would expect level 3 questions to be. All right, let's go back, if you will, to page 622. So conflict of interest, we said undisclosed dual agency is a conflict. Self-dealing is a conflict where you may or might make a secret profit. What if you see a property that you want to buy and the price is just right, but you know that something's going to happen that will affect the value and it'll be worth more later? Guys, you really need to disclose that. And that would be omission of a material fact, even if you're telling the seller, and even if it harms your opportunity to get it cheaper, you need to disclose it. You can't make a secret profit like that. Representing another broker without consent, tell me what that means.
You didn't get their permission.
Whose permission? Representing another broker without consent. Whose permission do you need?
The broker.
What broker?
The other one? Broker in charge?
Broker in charge. Guys, listen up. Here's what that's saying, and the heading isn't that clear, but here's what it's saying. When you go to work for a real estate company, you have one broker in charge, right? That one broker in charge will activate your license if you're not active. You don't have any more brokers in charge. There are no more than one broker. There's one broker in charge at each location, everybody. I've heard students say, well, aren't there more than one broker in charge at a company? No. There's one broker in charge at each physical location. So these companies that have branch offices, each physical location, there's a broker in charge. What this is saying, working for another broker without consent, you cannot do it because who's responsible for you? Your broker in charge. So it would be a very extenuating circumstance that you would even work for another broker and work for more than one. I have a student who has her real estate license in North Carolina, and she has her license in Florida. She works in North Carolina 6 months out of the year. She works in Florida 6 months out of the year. This broker in charge is in agreement. That broker in charge is in agreement, and that's okay. With their permission and their agreement, that's unusual. Most real estate brokers don't have more than one broker in charge. I can't even think of another example unless you wanted to be in general brokerage and you wanted to do some property management too. And your firm doesn't do property management, but this other firm does. Your big might not want you to do that. But that would be another example. With your broker in charge permission, may I also do some property management with this other firm? It would have to be with their informed consent. Because after all, they're responsible for you, and if you mess up, you know, your broker in charge could be responsible for something that you messed up when you were doing something else. So only with informed permission.
Is
Let's
that
just,
the same thing as the referring broker thing situation, where like, not referring, but when that broker comes from a different state to North Carolina, and they work in a supervision of a different broker? Is that?
are you talking about the commercial broker or the
Yeah.
mama who wants to send me a referral?
The commercial broker, I'm sorry.
He would have to affiliate with one broker when he's doing a transaction. You know, Barry asked, can every time they want to do a commercial transaction in Greensboro, North Carolina, do they have to be affiliated with that same broker? Your reading doesn't say that that has to happen. I would maybe think not, but you would have to sign an affiliation agreement with that one broker and a cooperation agreement with that one broker. I don't know that you could have two at the same time, but that's a good question. That's a good question. I don't know. Because the broker that you're affiliated with is not a broker in charge.
Right, so, but they're still under their broker in charge and their original bank, right?
That's correct.
But they're just working under like a regular,
Broker, somebody who can oversee and make sure things are done according to the way they are in North Carolina. So they're not going to have another broker in charge. Was that what you were asking about? They've got their broker in charge in another state. They don't need another broker in charge. But they do have to have a full broker who will oversee whatever this transaction is. Yeah, that's a good question on that. Let's do a couple more and we'll take our next break. On page 622, improper broker commission. Guys, you may not pay someone a referral fee or a commission or whatever we want to call it unless they have an active real estate license. Is everybody with me on that? There will be people who will want to send you business. In the field, we might call them our bird dog, looking for business and they want, and bringing you business. Guys, that's lovely to have people wanting to help you be successful, but you may not pay them anything unless they have a real estate license on active status. There is one exception. Do you remember what that is? We talked about it the other night. A vacation, the vacation rental. The Vacation Rental Agreement Act, there's one exception to paying somebody a referral fee, and that would be to a travel agent who sends you a lead on your vacation rental. They may not participate in the transaction at all, but you can pay them a referral fee even if they don't have a license. It's the only exception, everybody. Only exception. Everybody good on that? Okay, Tracy, was that you? Yeah. Good job. On page 623, your left-hand column is talking about unworthiness or incompetence. It's almost like a catch-all section, but did I give you the example one time? Did I tell you about the past student of mine who called me? She's got a real estate company, and she called me to say, I have a question, and I want to make sure if I'm doing this right. And her question was, one of her agents had a listing, and another agent in another company brings her an offer, to present to the seller. I don't know if I told y'all this. The offer is on out-of-date offer form. Out of date, we're no longer using it, so she brings an offer out-of-date form. The question to me is, what do we do about that? Well, now, guys, you know the rule. If an offer comes in, what are you supposed to do? Present it. All offers must be presented immediately, no later than 5 days, right? And in your reading it says, the commission isn't saying you got 5 days to do it. Immediately is where the emphasis is. I asked her, I said, well, did you ask her to resubmit? Put it on the proper form, because the way contracts change, what's in that one, it's not even close to what we're using right now, because things have changed over the years. And she said, yes, I asked the agent to bring it on the proper form, and she refused. Why do you think the agent refused? I'm curious about that. I have an opinion, but I don't know if I'm right.
She was
More
lying
work.
about her active status.
More work?
She was lying about her active status. Maybe.
I guess that could be.
Laziness.
Laziness, more work.
Maybe there's something in there.
Most likely.
The old contracts you like better.
Oh, that's a good point. You hear Kevin? He said, maybe there's something in that old contract that she liked better. Let me tell you what it was in it that she might would have liked better. That's an interesting point. The contract before the one that we have now with due diligence in it, the contract before this contract had a loan condition in it. In other words, if the buyer could not get their loan, they were out of the contract. This contract form 2T is not a loan condition, is it? It's a due diligence condition. Excellent point.
So they're looking for a reason to possibly make it voidable.
I would think. That's a good, I was sort of leaning on the other side. Incompetent, lazy, something. That was what I was thinking, and it's because I've been teaching for so long, I'm sure. Well, I told her, you have to present it, but I said, let me think about this and get back with you. So I called the real estate commission, they've got a legal department. And I gave the scenario, and the attorney I spoke with said, all offers must be presented. And I said, well, that's what we figured that. But he said, I'm pretty sure it's a guy, he said it's the seller's decision if they want to work with that offer or not. Present the offer, explain to the seller, wouldn't you explain, this is not the form we're using now. And there are things on it that are different now. So it would be up to the seller, do you want to work with this offer on this form, these terms, or do you want me to tell them to resubmit? Doesn't that sound real smooth?
Did they counter offer with the new proper contract?
Yeah, you could do that, I guess. Did y'all hear, my other Kevin? Kevin said, can you just have the seller counter on another offer? I reckon you could do that. Put the terms on it, and it's almost like they're making a new offer, but that's what a counter offer is, isn't it?
So even though the form is outdated, it's still like, it don't really matter.
No, it's obsolete. I'm talking about being incompetent, that would be obsolete. The commission says when forms change, you need to be competent to know the proper form to use. That would be a disciplinary, that would be a reason that the commission could discipline that person,
But
really.
now, I thought you said that they sell it up to the seller.
It is up to the seller because you have to present all offers. But when we're talking about the proper forms to use, the commission says you need to know what forms to use. But since the offer came in, we have to present it. And so when you present it to the seller, that's when you say to the seller, this is an obsolete form that we're getting, but it's up to you. It is an offer, right? Because think about it. If the offer said if the seller says I'm not taking it, the buyer could walk away, couldn't they? So it's up to the seller, and they could say, well, tell me what the big difference is. Tell me, what would be the pros and the cons. I would probably do more what Kevin said, or either encourage them to say resubmit on the proper form. I understand your question, Winter, though. I do understand. It's almost like, well, take it back and bring me the right one. But you can't do that if you violate another law, and the law says all offers must, or a commission rule, all offers must be presented. And so, an offer could come in on a napkin, right? And you gotta present it, right?
I don't think it can come in anyway.
So the buyer wouldn't be involved or anything?
Not the buyer.
Not the buyer thing.
That if a complaint was filed, the real estate agent, the commission could say that's incompetent. You need to know, if you're in this business and you're a realtor, you need to know what realtor forms to use. All right, let's see if there's anything else right here, because I know you want a break. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back and finish, see how far we can get.